Perhaps the most significant addition that there's been to this 2010 version of SharePoint is the addition of Performance Point services, which you typically get to by creating a Business Intelligence Center. On the Business Intelligence Center, if you go to the Create Dashboard section, you'll see a link to Start Using Performance Point Services. Now, Performance Point used to be a completely separate product from SharePoint. It had both a server-side product and a Windows application for designing what it called dashboards. This is what we're trying to do in SharePoint now, and Microsoft made Performance Point part of SharePoint 2010. It's a very significant product, and it really will feel to you like you're learning a completely different product. Now, Performance Point used to have its own Windows application for designing dashboards, and in fact that's still the case with this version of SharePoint. When I create the Business Intelligence Center, and then I go to this page for the first time that says I want to use Performance Point, I've got a button here that says Run Dashboard Designer. Clicking that button, when I do it for the first time, it will actually push back and install the Dashboard Designer program on my machine. Subsequently after that, I just click the button and it will open the program. So it's an interesting roundabout idea what's happening here. You create the site, you go to the site, you press a button and it pushes back a program to you. We use Dashboard Designer for several different reasons, and we're really defining little pieces of information that we're interested in and where it comes from. So the majority of what you do will be split into either defining data connections or performance point content. And by performance point content, we mean dashboards, which are really going to be our web pages, that contain scorecards, which are groups of scoring that typically contain smaller elements. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but just giving you some exposure to how you do this. I'm going to go to data connections here. I don't have any connections yet, but if I go to the Create section of my ribbon, the only thing that's open is a data source, which is where I can say, yes, this dashboard would like to get data from analysis services or Excel services, or import directly from an Excel workbook, get some data from a SharePoint list, get some data from a SQL Server table. Again, you're trying to have this idea that the dashboards you're looking at could be drawing together information from several different sources, because you don't want to think about, well, I just want to look at SharePoint and now I'll go to another program to look at SQL Server. You want to bring it all together. I'm actually going to do a SQL Server example. So let's imagine that we've got a completely separate legacy database out there that's handling our order system. And what I'm interested in is seeing bits of important information within my SharePoint site. So it's going to ask me to connect to the server, and I know right now it's the local machine, so I'm just going to use the dot there. The database I'm interested in is the AdventureWorks database, which is one of Microsoft's sample databases for information and will do okay for us in this particular need. And then I've got to select a table that I'm interested in. Well, there's a lot of data there, but I'm going to go for the sales order header, which will have my sales order information. Now, if you run into problems with connectivity, obviously this dashboard designer is trying to talk to the database, and your dashboards will as well. You may have to talk to your farm administrator to make sure that the connections are allowed between external programs and even between SharePoint and this external database. I'm going to click to the next tab, Properties, just to give this a name. I'll call this Connection Order Info. On the next tab, Time, we're really interested in, well, how are we starting to split this up? What am I looking at? If I'm interested in this little heartbeat of data, am I looking at the data for the year, for the month, for the week? Well, let's say I'm interested in the month, and just the month right now, so I'll leave the year alone, by order date. And that will allow me to group that information together. Then I'm going to shift to this final page, which actually allows me to even preview the data that's in that database right now. It's not very exciting, but it's got some order information with some total due information here. But here's the deal. I don't want to look at this, and this might be what I have to do, or I have to get my developers to write a custom program. I just want this all summarized for me. I want to find out how many orders were placed last month, for example. So let's say that's my data source defined. Of course, I'm doing one. You'd be defining several at the same time, most likely. Now I've got some data that I can look at. I need to create some performance point content, something that's going to visually represent that data. Now, the way I typically do it with Performance Point and with the Dashboard Designer is I go from the bottom up. I start talking about the individual pieces of data that I want and start defining those. Then I gather those together into what are called scorecards. And then I gather those together into what are called dashboards. And the dashboard, which is the overall view of the potentially dozens or hundreds of pieces of data you're looking at, the dashboard is effectively what's going to be your web page back in the SharePoint Business Intelligence Center. So let's do that from the bottom up. I'm going to create a KPI, a key performance indicator. By doing this, what I'm really telling Dashboard Designer is I'm interested in two pieces of data for each KPI. What is the actual number and what should it be? Big difference from just looking at a lot of lists of numbers, easily scanning them and saying, is this good or bad? So I have an actual line here, which says right now the data mapping to it is a fixed value of 1. Well, that's not really any use. I want my actual value to be the actual number of orders placed last month. So I'm going to go in here and change the source to my order info data connection that I just defined before and click OK. Then I'll have a drop down saying, well, which bit are you interested in? I'm interested in the total due. I could start adding what are called dimension filters, which is allowing me to go down by the due date month or the order date month, that kind of thing. For the moment, I'm just going to leave that. I am just trying to do a super simple one to show you. So I'm going to click OK. And then that is the actual information, but we also need to have the target. Now, I don't have the target actually stored in the database, so perhaps I'd be getting that from another data source like a SharePoint list, or in this case, I'm just going to have it typed in manually. I'm going to say it's got a fixed value of, let's say, $1 million a month. Now below this, you can actually define the thresholds, because by giving a KPI two pieces of information, you can allow it to show up in 3 different states. So in our case, if that number is going to be above $1 million, it's going to be showing up in green and the little green light. If it's from 100% of that value to 50%, it's going to show up in yellow, and below 50%, it's going to be bad. Well, you know, if I'm having a goal of $1 million a month, if we're at 500,000, that's pretty bad. So what I'd like to actually see here is that one kind of drawn back a little bit, that the threshold of that one would be, and I can either drag it or I can type it here, let's say 90%. I'm going to click Properties and just give this KPI a name. Could give it a description. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to hit Save to make sure that we've saved so far. So we have a KPI and a data connection defined. That's still not enough. I'm going to gather that KPI into what's called a scorecard. And the scorecard itself is the idea of something that can hold multiple pieces of data. I'll call this thing monthly information, because perhaps at a later point I could not only have the order total KPI, I could have the returns KPI, I could have all sorts of information added to this scorecard. All I'm going to do right now is see that on this scorecard, which is obviously blank right now, that we do have some available KPIs. I've only got one, the order total, so I'm going to bring that and drag that over, which makes that part of the scorecard. Again, I'm doing this very simply, so I've just got one right now. And it's actually going to preview that data, and right now it looks like we're not in great shape. That the order total is about 956,000 and the target was 1 million, so we're showing up in yellow. Not terrible, but not great either. This being my scorecard, I now need the final piece before we can get this back into SharePoint and create a dashboard. The dashboard is effectively going to be your page in your Business Intelligence Center. And if you have a lot of information, you might want to start gathering them into 2 columns or 2 rows or a header with 2 columns. I'm just going to go with the simple one, which is one zone, just one generic page with all our content to go in, and click OK. I'll call this dashboard Sales. And below we have a big blank area of dashboard content, and it says add a dashboard item to this zone by dropping it here. I'll expand my scorecards, find my monthly information scorecard, bring it over, drop it in, save this. But as you can imagine, you can add multiple scorecards and all sorts of other pieces to your dashboard. So after defining these 4 pieces, the data connection to describe the SQL Server database I want to talk to, the KPI to say the exact little piece that I'm really interested in and what it should be, containing that within the scorecard called monthly information, and holding that in the dashboard of sales. But I'm still in a Windows application, so How do I get this back into SharePoint? Well, what I can do is right-click my dashboard and say Deploy to SharePoint. It's asking, do you want to deploy to the dashboards library? It's checking that it's the right site, the ldcsharepoint.com/site/business for me. That looks okay. I'm going to leave all the default options here. I don't need a different master page. I don't need a page list for navigation. I'm just going to click OK. It'll think about that, deploy it, dump it into SharePoint. We've got our KPI, we've got our scorecard, we've got our sales page. Now, obviously, as you might imagine, if I'm such a business genius that I can't even hold the fact of one number in my head and whether this is good or bad, my company has other problems. The real point and the big benefit of dashboards is that after you've spent several days or even weeks building these things out and spent a lot of time talking around the conference table about what should be on them, you could go to a page like this and instantly see 100 of them just popping up, all drawing their information very dynamically. This is not fixed data. Whenever I view this page, it is actually fetching that information from the database. So I'm seeing the most up-to-date information there is, and being able to scan entire columns of these indicators and of these diagrams to find out what's going on in the business right now, and are we in good shape or are we in bad shape? What do we need to be looking at? And that's really the power of using Performance Point services, using the Dashboard Designer and building your dashboards to deploy into SharePoint. I'm going to save my first one locally because this is a Windows application, so it's just some data I might use later. If this is your first exposure to Performance Point, you're probably thinking, wow, good Lord, this is pretty significant. And it is. Bear in mind, this was a completely separate product that people had books on, they had conferences on. It's very substantial stuff. But this is the key and the starting point for real business intelligence inside SharePoint 2010.